My name is Liz Healey, and my daughter, Bevan, was born in 1980. So this was in the early days of implementation. We live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it was before the early intervention law had been passed. So we lived through the very early days of implementing the new law, and we participated over the course of Bevan's education in some of the evolving aspects and additions to the law. Oh. Can you just go through these four pretty quickly and stop on the fourth? But in my own childhood, I didn't have the benefit of knowing other people who had disabilities who could help me think about Bevan's life and Bevan's future. My own school experience was I went to an elementary school. I grew up in Wellesley in Massachusetts, and there weren't any children with disabilities in the school. As a young child, I didn't know anybody who had a disability. But I remember very vividly when I was in about fourth or fifth grade. When I was in about second grade, the polio epidemic, it was that summer when polio became a horrible epidemic in this country. And in about fourth or fifth grade, our Girl Scout troop went to go and sing and bring presents to the children who were living in iron lungs. So can you go to that next picture? This isn't a picture of the place that I was in, but it wasn't that dissimilar. It didn't have so many kids in it. And this was in about 56 or 57. So this is kind of my first impression of what congregate living was like for children with disabilities. It was awful. It was just awful seeing all those kids all in a room together, so isolated, and nobody knew they existed. If you didn't go there, you would have never seen them. And then when I went on to junior high school, I was the first wave of the baby boomers. So typically in Wellesley, each class, the whole cohort across the town had about 250 students in it. Our class had 500. So the junior high school was just pressed to the limits. And because my maiden name began with a T, I was in a homeroom that was in the basement. And I think it was a room that typically wasn't used. And there were two rooms down there. And the room next to us was called Room 2. And that was the first time that I had any exposure to kids who learned differently. And the kids in Room 2 weren't very different than all the rest of us, but they never left Room 2. And if I hadn't had that homeroom, I would have never known they were there. We were by the boiler. We were down in the boiler room. There were these two classes down there by the boiler room. And then when I was in high school, I remember when President Kennedy was elected, that he talked about he had a sister with an intellectual disability. And he didn't talk about it as something that was shameful or something that should be hidden. And he talked about, and I was very aware that his sister was very much a part of their family. They all grew up together as kids, that the norm in their family was that everybody valued and everybody mattered. And just a little aside, when I was sort of going through some history, in 1961, President Kennedy appointed a special presidential panel on mental retardation. And in 1961, the focus of that panel was to figure out how to reduce the number of people who were living in residential institutions. Around that same time, my grandmother had a series of strokes and was placed in a nursing home. And it was really clear that she needed a lot of support, more than my mother and my aunt could provide. And I visited her often, and I just kept thinking, no one should live like this. No one should live in this kind of an environment. So can we go to the next slide? So in 1981, Bevan was about a year old, and I was painfully aware of this Baby Doe case that came into the national news. And Baby Doe's parents had decided, because Baby Doe had a disability, and I believe she had Down syndrome, that they were petitioning to be able to withhold food and nutrition from her. They wanted to kill their child. And it just like it made me so angry. We were working so hard to keep Bevan alive, my husband and I, and it was, things were very fragile. It also made me really angry that this community of people that were advocating very strongly that Baby Doe had a right to life and Baby Doe should not have food and nutrition withheld, also seemed to be people that, to me, weren't saying, and what about when she grows up? What about her life? What kind of supports do we need to make sure that Baby Doe is going to have a good life? And I kept thinking about people were more interested in being alive than having a life. And I kept thinking, this could be my daughter. So it was pretty hard. So I began to think very early on about Bevan. So what was it that I wanted for Bevan? What kind of a future did I want Bevan to have? And I knew pretty clearly what I wanted for Bevan. Can you go to slide 7? I wanted her to thrive and grow and learn and have friends and family who loved her, and enjoyed having her be a part of their lives, not be like Baby Doe. Can you go to the next slide? I wanted her to be able to go to school with kids from the neighborhood and not be cloistered away like those kids in the iron lungs from my youth. I wanted her to grow up and to be able to have friends that she would really enjoy being with. Can you go to the next slide? Sort of lost where we are. Okay. And can you just go through the next 2 slides up to slide 11? So we did regular things as a family. We went to the beach. I learned that strollers, when they go in salt water, don't work after that. But that was the kind of life that we worked really hard. Bevan's education began when she was 4, her formal education. I had tried to get her into specialized preschools, but this was 1984, and the early intervention law hadn't been passed yet through Congress. And so there were several specialized preschools in Pittsburgh, and I went to all of them. And every single one of them had different reasons why Bevan wasn't appropriate to be in their schools. One said she had no rehabilitation potential. One said she was too great a medical liability to have in their program. It went on like that. I wanted to show you a very short little video, and what I'm going to do instead is direct you to, on YouTube, there's an interview that was done as a TASH project, and it's an interview with Judge Broderick. And the beginning of it begins with Judge Broderick talking about the Park case and what he learned and what brought him to make that decision. And he really talked about much of what Kate has talked about, that sort of experience of families. It's really touching. That little segment, most of the video is about the Pennhurst case. The first part begins with talking about, he said, before we talk about Pennhurst, I want to talk about Park. And it's really pretty touching. And Judge Broderick, as Tom knows, was a giant. He was one of the 3 judges on that panel. He was also on the Pennhurst case. It's a little snippet. It was converted from VHS tape to a digital format, so it's a little grainy, but well worth listening to. So the era that we're thinking about is Park has passed, IDA has passed, and Bevan is approaching starting school in 1984. And the school district actually let her start a year early at only age 4, since there wasn't any other form of preschool education available to her. And one of the most amazing things was, after all these preschools said, no. Nobody said Bevan couldn't come to school. Bevan was allowed to go to school. I didn't have to fight. And that was because of the zero reject policy. And the yin and yang of it is Bevan went to Pioneer Education Center because that's where the district provided education for kids like Bevan. So I was really grateful that she was welcomed but it clearly was not my dream for what her education should look like. It reminded me of those kids and the environments the kids in Iron Lungs were in, and it felt a whole lot like the nursing home that my grandmother had been in. So like many other places around the country, Pittsburgh had initially implemented the Education of All Handicapped Children's Act by creating separate facilities for kids, isolated, and continued the isolation of kids with disabilities. But on the other hand, she was in school. It's like the first day I remember, it was like, and I think I'm going to cry. This is just, the environment is awful. But in the process of Bevan beginning her education, I had a voice in saying what was important for her and what she should learn when she was in school. So I wanted to make sure in the IEP, it didn't just say that she could hold her head up for 30 seconds on 3 consecutive trials. I wanted to make sure that they focused on how Bevan was going to blow out the candles on her birthday cake. And I don't know if we passed the birthday, there was a birthday cake picture there somewhere. Yeah, and her brother, of course, wanted to help. But we'd rigged up a little fan with a switch. Bevan could hit the switch, the fan would blow and blow the candles out. But as she was at Pioneer, my unease about the type of education she was getting grew. And another one of the amazing things about the Park case and process in place where I could say, I think it should be different. And through that, I really began to learn about LRE. And there's this interesting interplay between procedural safeguards and LRE for Bevan. Bevan had to have a nurse with her at school. And we had been paying for it with our insurance. And we had a lifetime cap, and we were at age 5 or 6, felt like we were racing toward that cap. So I asked the school district, and we had a due process hearing asking the school districts to pay for her nursing services. And we won the due process hearing, but it was appealed to federal court, and we lost in federal court. And the district's threat had been that if they lost, that they were going to reevaluate Bevan, and they were going to declare that she was not going to benefit from education, and they were going to bar her from school. So although we didn't at that time succeed in getting the school district to pay for her nursing care, thank God for the zero reject policy, because that was the big stick that they kept trying to hold over us. And it was years later that another child from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who was a child with a spinal cord injury, who was like what I think of as the truly deserving disabled child, which should spend money on education, brought that same suit that he couldn't be in school without a nurse, and they prevailed, and then it became the law of the land that school districts had to begin to pay for those kinds of services. And we began to then, there's been a lot of, Kate was really powerful in talking about how limited the education was. Bevan was a little bit later, so there was equipment in the classroom. Not great stuff, but there was equipment in the classroom. And so we began to then be involved in the evolution of what education should look like. And one of the things I knew from the get-go, in the basic law, not something that they added on later, but LRE was in there from the beginning, and the district didn't have a clue about what it meant. So we felt that we really were very active in beginning to get the school district to imagine what specially designed instruction could be, and what did LRE really mean. And so I began, using all the channels that I could. I tried first through the IEP process, saying that it was really essential for Bevan to be able to grow up with other kids and interact with other kids. And in that point in time, the Pioneer Center shared a parking lot with an elementary school. And so I just wanted the kids from Pioneer to be included over at the elementary school, and they'd all go to school together. They wouldn't do that. But what they did do is what they called reverse inclusion, and they brought some kids over for like an hour once a week. And again, it just felt like when I was visiting the kids in the Iron Lungs, you know, it wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't. So then I had another great idea Bevan was in the ESY program. And I thought, I can get LRE this way. The center school was not air conditioned. The district had programs in the summer for other students who didn't have disabilities, and those programs took place in air conditioned buildings. So I said it was really a burden on these kids to be in wheelchairs and braces and all these kinds of things in this terrible heat, and they needed to be in an air conditioned building. Let's just move the summer program to the air conditioned building. Be careful what you ask for. They air condition the center. So the final way that I finally succeeded in getting LRE for Bevan was I ran for the school board. And I was elected to the school board. And one of the principals then became very eager to have a school board member's child in her school. And then we began the challenges of figuring out how can Bevan participate in the general education program, and what does it look like to be included with other kids, and how can she participate in the same curriculum as other kids. And it was a journey to try and figure those things out. The next piece as things evolved was transition. And I have to tell you, we used the IEP process for Bevan to go to college. And it was so hard to get the school district to include her. And at the college, they felt like it was part of their mission. It was a Catholic college. We sort of made it a trade-off. We said, you know, you're preparing so many students in so many different career fields to work with people with disabilities. It's critical that they see people with disabilities as friends and as people before they see them as clients. And they were really on board with that. And the college kids really could relate to the fact that Bevan was the same age as they were, that there were things that they enjoyed doing, and they wanted to figure out how she could be a part of it. And it really was a team effort, and they did a tremendous job, and she was in a sorority, and she did all kinds of things. So I always kind of, one of my things that I really like is the Gandhi quote that you have to be the change you want to see in the world. So I had learned about parent training and information centers. I knew they existed. I knew the one in Pennsylvania was very opposed to inclusive practices. And I felt from my friends like Barbara Buswell in Colorado, who I knew from being on the TASH board with Barb, that I could write a proposal and I could try and start a parent center in Pennsylvania that would be promote inclusive practices. Because through my experience, I had learned about the law. I had learned how to use the law. And I really wanted to create a place where we could help other parents be able to get their kids the foot in the door. I always think of Lester Maddox with his, what did he have, an axe handle when he was trying to keep people out? That I wanted to be able to help other parents get in. And I wanted to be able to help parents figure out and teachers figure out how do you, once you get in the door, what do you do? And I really realized that we need to be raising up the next generation. We really need the next generation of parents to be prepared to be effective advocates. And that it was really parents that were at the heart of making all of these changes from the beginning happen. So to summarize, because of EHA and IDEA, Bevan got to go to school. There were a lot of people who had cleared the path ahead of us. You know, just like in Brown versus Board of Education, which was talked about earlier, the Topeka, Kansas School District defended itself and said, if we let black kids in, we'll have to let in disabled kids too. So there were a lot of parents who had fought those battles. And I had testified in 1997 before the US Senate on the reauthorization of IDEA, and we had that great process that Tom was leading, and we'd get together every month in DC and met with David Hoppy and other people. It was very heady times. But so I was on a panel. When you testify before Congress, they have three kind of similar related people on a panel. And I was on a panel with another school board member, and my instruction was, you are not a parent, you are the president of the Pittsburgh School Board, you are here in that role, you aren't going to look like a softie on disability, you're going to have the data on why not suspending kids with disabilities and why not putting in these draconian disciplinary policies that they were trying to put into IDA at that time, why they were bad for those kids and why they were bad for the school district. And another person sitting on the panel with me was from New Hampshire, and he kept saying, really? You know, like on these little asides, you can do that? You've done that? Oh, you know, we're trying to exclude this one child because we don't think they have the potential to learn. And I thought, oh my God, it's 97 and we're still back to this zero reject policy. People are thinking, you know, that they could keep that child out. But because we had the right to participate in the individualized planning process, and we were able to object, we made it possible for Bevan to go to school with other kids, to grow up in a rich and stimulating environment, and to engage the school district in redefining LRE, what it meant, what their obligations were, and how to do it. Figuring out how to do it was what we learned was, if you want to do it, you can figure it out. If you don't think it should happen, it's impossible to figure out. And so we felt like we were really defining the development of some inclusive teaching strategies. And we got so much help from other people in TASH. And so what it's led to, what Bevan's education and her inclusive education led to, was that she graduated with her peers. She was able to go on with her same age peers to college, still part of her IEP program. And that college experience has led to kind of lifelong, this is a high school graduation, now we're getting to college. That's what she had on her sorority T-shirt there, and those were friends from college. She went to music classes. One of the things Lou Brown used to talk about is, if you have a significant disability, I think he put it, was that all subjects are optional or something like that. There weren't any required courses. So Bevan took the things that she most enjoyed, and she took a number of music classes at Duquesne, and it was terrific. And if you go ahead, oh yeah, go ahead. These lifelong friends, going to weddings of the kids she went to college with, continuing to be friends. And then the last slide is, you know, sort of going out and about, getting downtown, going to festivals, doing things. None of this would have happened without the advocacy of parents. And we really need to work hard to raise up the next generation, and we need to be forever vigilant. It's taken allies like Tom and Frank and Judy and Barbara to really make all of this happen. And it takes educators who are willing to believe that they can figure it out, you know, they can give it a try and they can figure it out. And it takes judges like Raymond Broderick, who was really quite an exceptional person, to believe in equal protection. And so our challenge in this present climate is to be vigilant, to protect the rights that are in IDEA, and to press forward, and for the law to continue to evolve so that we can make the dreams of all students and their families come true.